Right, our Lisa Warren, who was in the previous session, she's done a lot of this type of background work on profitability estimation, and the same as John, with a vast experience in other parts of the state that I lack. So, and the three of us have been analysing the Elmore data, and so the use for the future, lambs, wool and profit, that was this is our first trial. We're now into our second trial at Elmore, and in my retirement I'm a volunteer with the Elmore running this trial like everyone else. So that's the Elmore Lamb group that do a lot of the work in the trial, and certainly the Elmore Field Day staff, keep an eye on the sheep during lambing on an everyday basis. And so it's a Campaspe Lamb Producers group. So the first part of it is overview of the U trial results, then how we did the economic analysis, then the financial results, and we're forgetting about that part today because there's basically no time. So the U trial, 210 ewes, 5 breeds, 40 ewes per breed, and each breed came from 3 properties and 14 ewes per property. So this was to make it statistically valid for people that like these sort of things. So they were crossbred ewes from Super Border Rams, a subgroup within the Border Leicester Breed Society, Merinos, Pepin type from local studs, local Merinos, and 3 dual purpose types, Centre Plus Merinos, Doonies and Sams. Centre Plus, we've got pretty good breeding ASBVs for all these dual purpose characters, and Doonies and Sams, there's certainly a lot of interest in those, especially when we started, and they're all in the district as well. So the key measurements that we were looking at were lambing percentage, lamb growth, wool weight and fibre diameter, and the mature weights of the ewes. So the main interest, I suppose, is in the lambing percentage of the different types of sheep. And so over the 5 adult years, we had 132% out of the first cross ewes and the Sams. The local Merinos, the Loddon Valleys and the Doonies were virtually identical. And the Centre Plus Merinos, the dual purpose type Merinos, were about dead in the middle. So we look at the lamb returns, including the skins. We've got, this takes into account the lambing percentage, the weights of the lambs from the different breed groups, and their dressing percentages. So certainly the first cross ewes and the Sams had the heaviest lambs. The dual-purpose Merinos are about 0.7 of a kilo behind, and exactly the same as the Doonies, and the Loddon Valley Merinos were a bit further behind again. But they were about 3.3 or 3.4 kilos in live weight, in lamb weight behind the crossbreds, and they're also down by about, I think, 0.9 of 1% in dressing percentage. So the wool returns, okay, there's a lot more measurements in other documents about diameters and weights, all that sort of stuff. But the first cross ewes and the Sams, reasonably similar in fleece weight. The 2 Merinos, the Centre Plus, were reasonably similar. These certainly cut a lot more wool, but these were 2 microns finer. And so this is the prices of the actual times of when we went through them at the time the trial was running. And later on we'll get to whole historical prices and look at that. And the Doonies were a bit behind again in wool value. When we add up the lamb and wool returns, certainly meat returns and wool returns, meat returns, wool returns, meat returns, wool returns, that sort of thing. You can see that, but these are returns per ewe and haven't got the DSC rating based on the ewe body weight and the lambing percentage built into it. So, and also the lamb growth rate. So this would have a higher DSC rating because the lambs are growing a bit, grow heavier, so they've got a higher DSC rating than those. Yes. So this is a slide that skipped. And this is the ewe weights over the 5 years of the trial. So they were born in their home farms here. They arrived at Elmore when they were that age. They were joined as ewe lambs here. We haven't included the ewe lamb results. They were joined for their first adult lambing there. They were joined for their second adult lambing there. And then we had 3 adult lambings over there. They were what we'd call normal industry weights through that first 2 joinings. Then we had a wet summer, 20 inches of rain, abundant weeds. We had 12 months green feed, and so the ewes went up in weight. And then next summer we had 14 inches of rain. We can all remember those, especially in northern Victoria. We had all those grass summer weeds, that sort of thing, right through. Right, now John will take over part 2.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And look, I must say, Kieran's done a fantastic job with this trial over a long period of time. And a lot of you are familiar with a lot of the outputs which have come out of it, and continuing it with the new group of ewes, quite different, but really valuable information which will come out of it, no doubt. What I'm going to talk about is specifically looking at the financial analysis of this whole system with the different ewe breeds, looking at long-term profitability of the different systems. And I'll just explain a bit of background. But I mean, in reality, if you look at the Southwest Victorian farm monitor data comparing wool sheep and prime lamb enterprises, there's and the prime lamb enterprises comprise both specialist prime lamb flocks and dual purpose flocks, but there's a huge variation in profitability over the long term if you look at it. And but drilling that down further, within the wool and within the prime lamb enterprises, there's a huge difference in the profitability of individual enterprises based on how they manage it, the genetics and so on. But you can see commodity prices and systems and seasons make a huge variation over the long haul. So with that in the background, we thought to determine long-term profitability of the enterprises requires quite a sophisticated analysis. So we wanted to look at long-term climatic conditions. So we modelled it over about 20 odd years, but you could have done it over 100 years. It just takes it longer for the computer to generate the outputs if you do it over 100 years of actual climatic data. And we've used actual commodity prices of wool, lamb, grain prices as well over the long haul. And so we've had fantastic seasons in there and hideous droughts as well. So that's been a pretty important point. And also, I mean, when you look at the per head stuff, to look at overall per hectare profitability, you've got to consider the ewe size as well, because they take ewes. Obviously, bigger ewes might have better per head performance, but what about their per hectare performance? So we've taken into account relative body weight of the different systems as well. If you look at, so we thought we better trial it over different areas as well, analyse over different areas. So we've done a Southwest Victorian Hamilton perennial ryegrass type pasture, 15 DSEs per hectare, and then looked at Elmore with 2 systems, a loosened crop system where the lambs are finished and sold by March, and also with an annual pasture system and crop where lambs are sold by November. Also, we've gone up to northeast Victoria as well. We've looked at Rutherglen, running 10 DSE per hectare, slightly different lambing date based on when would be most profitable for the different areas. So for a ewe lamb enterprise, and lambs are sold by November. So we've looked at different areas in terms of the outputs, in terms of profitability with the core data we've generated out of that Kieran's generated out of Elmore. So if we look at just from a seasonal variation, you can see at Elmore, Rutherglen and Hamilton, quite different. I mean, obviously higher rainfall down at Hamilton, that's the black median rainfall or average rainfall is the black line, but you can see the variation there, and immediately shows there's the very wet years at Rutherglen are as wet as the wet years at Hamilton, but the dry years, the drought years, are a lot worse down at Rutherglen compared to Hamilton, and that similar large variation is also at Elmore as well. So tighter seasonal, less variation at Hamilton, no surprise there, perhaps to a lot of people. If we specifically look at what's happened with long-term land prices, it goes up and down over time, but there's been a trend, and obviously you'd have to be locked up in somewhere without any communication to understand that land prices have been at the higher end more recently. But some of those years that they weren't even more recently, if we adjust the earlier prices with inflation, there's not massive difference between them, but it's certainly been trending up. And in the first half of the year, the land price tends to be a little bit less than the second half of the year. A couple of exceptions, if you quickly scan across there, I think 2005-06, spring and early summer was better than autumn, and same with 2012-13, and same thing. And you look at wool prices, if we're from our system, which ran from about there hasn't been huge premiums in contrast to beforehand. But we still factored in for the different types of sheep the premiums and discounts for what they actually physically produced out of the trial. Then we look at grain prices, long term, again adjusted for inflation, so we're all talking in current dollars. And you can see there's been these spikes are usually associated with drought, bloody ordinary year drought in some areas, full-on drought, major drought, and following year major drought, although that 2007-8 year there was a world spike in grain prices as well, happened as well as world supplies. But interestingly, 2015 year, which is pretty much a severe drought in a lot of areas, because world grain prices were so low, I mean, it was a very unusual drought, cheap grain, so it was pretty easy to justify feeding them for sure. So we factored in those longer term commodity prices as well. If we look specifically at outputs, and there's a massive number of outputs, we'll just take a few snapshots here. You can see this is up at Rutherglen with the annual pasture system with first cross ewes, and this is the actual gross margin per hectare for the first cross ewes with those commodity prices and local seasonal conditions and farm system, and quite a big variation, but this is a period of moderate or lower land prices. Really got hit hard with very poor seasonal conditions over those 2000s, and then more recently, pretty good year, seasonal conditions and excellent land prices. So you can see there's quite a big variation over time. So that's one set of data. If we look at down to Hamilton with a perennial ryegrass system with the first cross ewes, what's really striking is that they missed out, and those largely missed out on the really tough seasonal conditions, although 6, 7 and 7, 8 were still pretty serious droughts down that part of the world. But compared to other areas of the state, the impact wasn't nearly as apparent, which was quite interesting. And for people looking down to Hamilton to say, yeah, well, that's right, and for the locals they might debate that, but that's the reality of it, and I'd certainly, based on all the information I've seen from producers across Victoria, it's giving pretty consistent and realistic outputs. If we drill down to the different enterprises, and this is a summation for Rutherglen, but similar picture across the board, is look at the blue is from 95 to 2001-2, the red is from 2002 to 2008-9, and the green is 2009-10 to 2015-16. But what's relevant with this? I mean, whilst there's differences with different seasons in those 7-year blocks, you can see the relative ranking between the different ewe breeds really didn't change across the board. So in the blue, in the 95 to 2001-2, the first cross ewes in this first column, their ranking was similar to the Loddon Valley Merinos and the Centre Plus Merinos and Dooneys and Sams and so on. So that relative ranking really didn't change across the board for the different ewe breeds and the different sets of commodity prices and seasonal conditions. And I mean, look, what I see in reality, that's exactly the case. It does. People will say, oh, but we're different down this area. Well, that's not quite true. There is local circumstances which do tweak things and all that sort of stuff, but that sort of output was pretty predictable from my perspective in reality. If you just drill down to look at the last 7 years, which a lot of people actually got better recollections of, you can see that, look, they all, this is on a gross margin per DSE level, so we've taken into account of that body weight differences. We've taken into account depreciation differences with the different, depending on longevity and also the actual long-term values of sheep and so on. But you can see that there is quite different differences between breeds, and I'll let you make your own assessment of that data. But it's quite compelling differences in seasons and in different ewe breeds, which is really important to realise. If you look at the combining all the different systems together over the 21 years, you can see that relative ranking across the different farm systems doesn't change with the different ewe breeds. It's largely the same. There's a bit of tweaking between the systems, but it doesn't change your overall picture to what that previous slide was showing in terms of the relative ranking and performance of the different ewe breeds in this trial. So, and I think that's an important message to understand. So, look, we'll just finish up, and if there's any questions to finish up, that'd be terrific. But look, the reality is there's large differences in profitability based on ewe breed and this data, and when we used actual data from the trial and combined that into a whole production system to give our outputs. I mean, key factors include the fleece values of the different breeds, reproductive performance, lamb values, ewe depreciation, ewe body weight, taking into account that stocking rate part of the equation. So, in essence, please do your sums carefully when you're looking at the different systems, if you're looking at changing, because it's not just a simple answer of looking, oh, this one's got a higher lambing percentage. What about the reproductive performance? What about the lambs they're producing? What about the fleece values? At the moment, 2016, 17, obviously a large increase in the value of merino wool and finer wool, and so that's going to put more, just at the current time, it's even going to look better for those merinos in the system. So anyway, look, we'll leave it at that. If there's any questions, fire away. And so we've got a few minutes, I think, before we have to move on. So any questions? And look, one thing I would say, there'll be a more comprehensive report will come out of this, so you'll have the opportunity to look at it in more detail. This is a snapshot of where we're at, but it's certainly been an incredibly powerful bit of analysis with using that data that Kieran and the Elmore group have generated over a number of years. Okay.
Would lambing time would it change those figures?
We set the lambing time for the different systems, what we considered was the biological optimum for the different areas. So I don't think it would make a big difference, but it does tweak, say, for example, with more so crossbred ewes, the earlier you go, all of them are going to be subject to a lot more feeding, and there's going to be a penalty for reproductive performance going earlier, particularly with the crossbreds compared to the merinos. But we set the lambing time based on what we considered was pretty much the optimal time for those specific areas, based on a lot of grass-grown modelling. So I don't think, in essence, it would change the fundamentals of those results.
No, it wouldn't change it. But with the actual Elmore figures, we did change the lambing time around a fair bit. So we had some early lambings and some late lambings, because if we lambed early all the time, the crossbred ewes would be at a disadvantage because they're more seasonal breeders. And we looked for that. We had 5 different lambing times, and there was a slight trend to lower lambing percentages with the crossbreds with earlier ones. But yeah, it might have been about 6 or 7% compared with the others, you know, because we had 2 lambings and then back went. But so it was, as you'd expect, so what we've presented there is the average.
Yep, two things with this. I mean, it would be fantastic to do the whole farm system thing with a self-replacing thing, but we're talking a serious amount more investment to do that biological thing. And that's why things like grass grow are fantastic for modelling that, which would, if you did that whole thing on a larger scale, you're talking several $100,000. And I mean, most of this was done with volunteer work. It was an amazing bit of work. But Kieran's got a bit more data, which to comment on that.
Yeah, just on that, which was section 4 of the show, but we just haven't got time, was an analysis of a local farm that had about 14 years data comparing he had a dual-purpose merino flock. They weren't Centre Plus, but reasonably similar to it. He had merino weather lamb weights and prices, and crossbred white Suffolk merino cross prices for 14 years to make a comparison, and we went through that, and basically the short answer is a merino ewe rearing replacements for the other half of the enterprise and selling lambs as merino weather lambs in autumn after shearing them just before sale is about equal in profitability with lucerne, but we've only done that system because that fella had accurate figures over a long period of time, and we're quite, but in other systems we don't know.
I think, I mean, and just to add to that, and it's really important with the merino side of it too, is don't forget those fleece values. It's just so important. No. And I consistently see this. I mean, if you've got fleece values which are up in the, where they should be, but I mean, in terms of the relative, it's so important in driving the profitability. I've seen people with sort of pretty crappy merinos, and a lot of them, to be perfectly honest, are drifted out. That's one of the reasons why a lot of merinos have drifted out. It's actually been a very good drafting grade for a lot of the less profitable bloodlines of merinos, I must say. And so, but it is so important in essence, if you're doing everything else the same, and you've got a fleece value which is $15 higher for no extra effort, and that's all to do with genetics, you can't ignore that in terms of the bottom line. It's a really important thing. So, but and you see this, there's this huge variation if you look at the Farm Mondo Group data. I mean, in terms of there's really good merino type enterprises, and there's really good composite enterprises, first cross ewe enterprises. It's how it's managed, and that's a good thing. It's a lot of that, all of it, is in management control, and that's where the real opportunity is.
More questions?
That Elmore lucerne system was 7.5 DSE. That's including crop and stubble grazing, winter grazing of cereals and summer stubbles. On the uncropped area, it was about 9.3 DSE a hectare, which reflects reality on about 3 or 4 farms around here that have given me a lot of figures to back it up.
Yeah, no, and so we tried to use really things. I mean, the question is, would things change in the relative ranking? And I think, I mean, one thing, I mean, you could say, well, what about things like worms and all that sort of stuff in higher rainfall areas? And that's certainly a factor which you need to consider with some of the merinos in particular in the higher rainfall areas. I think one thing if you really, and Charlie made a comment last night, and it's quite true about, I mean, if you put a high production composite into a really dodgy environment, I mean, it's going to produce pretty low value, crappy store lamb. Any store lamb's worth money this year, but I mean, year in, year out, it's not going to be a very exciting enterprise. And that where you're more focused on the wool side of things, it's not as exposed to that thing. But I mean, on the other side of the coin, the specific ewe-only type enterprise is by far the best one for fitting into the pasture growth curve in most areas. It's really fits in really well. And whereas more dry merino, more dry sheep in it's a lot flatter in terms of you can push your weathers harder and all that sort of stuff. But again, it's a really dynamic system, and there's all these factors need to be taken into account. So whenever somebody puts up their hand to say, I'm sick of this, I want to change, it's really important just to look at all those factors when you're making that change. Okay.
Authorised by Victorian Government, 1 Treasury Place, Melbourne.